Diplomat's Archives, Hidden Stories. This is the 25th story.
My name is Ivan Jančarek. I'm a Czech ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and I will be very happy to share some insights of the Czech-Korean relations from the history.
2025 marks the 35th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Korea and Czechia.
We've been now in 35 years of our diplomatic relations, and we have a 10 years anniversary of the strategic partnership.
But did you know that long before the two countries officially established diplomatic ties, Korea and Czechia had already shared a surprisingly special connection? And that remarkable story begins right here from this old newspaper. The name of this newspaper is Československý deník, which translates to Czechoslovak Daily in English. It was first published in 1917 by the Czechoslovak Legion. At first glance, this old newspaper might seem unrelated to Korea. However, our team discovered several articles mentioning Korea within it. So how could a newspaper published by the Czechoslovak Legion over 100 years ago include articles about Korea? To answer this question, we first need to understand what the Czechoslovak Legion was. In 1914, World War I broke out. This four-year war was fought between the Allied powers and the Central Powers. At the time, the Czech lands were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When World War I broke out, Czech soldiers were conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army.
Our soldiers were actually mobilized, and they have to start to fight, on the side of the Austrian and Germany. In the beginning, everyone thought that the war will be very quick, but then when the war started to actually protract, and go further and further, and more people were wounded and died, the more it was unpopular. So for the Czech population and for the Czechs, as well, it was like fighting, about something which they don't feel that it's their own interest. So the first Czech Legion was actually introduced in Russia, and they started, to fight against the Austrians again.
Not long after the war began, a separate military force, primarily made up of Czechs and Slovaks living in Russia, began to take shape, which later came to be known as the Czechoslovak Legion. They fought on the side of the Allies against the Central Powers, driven by their desire for national independence.
And it was very well organized military unit. And it was not only on the Russian front, not only in Russian territory, but we had as well, legions, in Italy, in Serbia, and in France. So in the end, we are counting around 50,000 who were actually fighting in the Czechoslovak legions.
However, in 1917, the Czechoslovak Legion's mission took a dramatic turn. This was because it was also the year of the Russian Revolution. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power and established the Soviet government in Russia. As such, Russia soon withdrew from World War I, and a civil war erupted between the Red Army and the White Army. The Czechoslovak Legion, which had been supported by Imperial Russia, had to find a new path after Russia's withdrawal from the war. At that time, Tomáš Masaryk, the leader of the Czech independence movement, who later became the first president of Czechoslovakia, gave the Legion the following orders. Following Masaryk's direction, the Czechoslovak Legion decided to travel east along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok and from there return to Europe by sea. Thus began the Legion's long and arduous journey across Siberia in early 1918. Their massive train convoy even included a hospital, post office, and bank. To better understand the circumstances of the time, we spoke with an expert in a video call.
So my name is Milada Polishinská. I am a Czech professor of history. My main field of specialization is diplomatic history.
Professor Milada Polishinská, a scholar who has long studied Czech diplomatic history, has also conducted extensive research on the early connections between Korea and Czechia.
In terms of supplies, unimaginable, because Russia was affected by starvation, by lack of everything, and the Legion was actually very large. It was almost 70,000 soldiers. So if you imagine how many people found themselves on the Trans-Siberian Magistral at the same time in the trains, and those people needed to eat something. No, this was a huge task. So the Legion actually finally developed as basically its own businesses. They started their own banking system, and this bank provided all banking operations as a standard bank. Under those conditions, this was the only way how actually the legions could manage the financial resources.
The journey of the Czechoslovak Legion back to Europe was extremely arduous. It took more than 2 years before they reached Europe. The Československý deník, the newspaper we saw earlier, also continued to be published on board the trains as they made their way across Siberia. What you're looking at now is an original copy of Československý deník. 4 issues are currently preserved at the Seoul Museum of History. But who was the person who donated these newspapers to the museum?
My name is Jaroslav Olša. I am a career diplomat for more than 30 years, working in various continents and places, but I also served as ambassador to Korea between 2008 and 2014. Whenever I go to any country like to Korea, I started collecting the Koreana in my home country. And I really collected various books, well-known and not known, or even unknown. And one moment, there was a lot of Československý deník available in the second-hand bookshop in Prague. And I said, okay, why not? And I bought something like 200 copies of accidentally saved. Many of them were really destroyed. And I said, there will definitely be something interesting.
And in 2011, he donated 15 Korean-related items which he had collected to the Seoul Museum of History. Among them were 4 original issues of Czechoslovensky Deník, the ones you see here.
The Deník was the most important information source for all the soldiers. That's why it covered everything, from a daily news of the army itself, but also including the news what's going on around the world. And that's why Korea, which was very close, and it was very interesting for the legionnaires, was prominently featured in Deník many times.
Shortly after the Czechoslovak Legion began its journey across Siberia, on October 28, 1918, Czechoslovakia declared its independence. And the following year, the Czechoslovensky Deník carried several brief reports about Korea. Then why were these articles about Korea published in the Czechoslovak Legion's newspaper at the time?
I think that was a part of the what was happening in the region, and I think by the time the first march of independence movement was some of the biggest uprising against the Japanese colonial rule that time, and then actually for those who were fighting for freedom and for having understanding that other countries actually as well are fighting for their freedoms, that was why it was important to inform about those kinds of events.
As for why the Legion took interest in what was happening in Korea at the time, there may be another explanation.
Coming closer and closer to Vladivostok, legionnaires were meeting more and more Koreans. We also have roughly 50 photographs in our archives showing legionnaires mingling with the Koreans in Vladivostok. There is a beautiful photo of 2 legionnaires standing and making really a photographic memory of a Korean marriage. That means there was a plenty of connection and plenty of context between the Czechs and Koreans. Was it a curiosity? Of course it was a curiosity. In the same moment, Czechs are curious people. They wanted to know who the Koreans are, what the Korea is, what's going on in Korea. That was the reason why it was there.
The story of Korea and the Czechoslovak Legion doesn't end here.
There was a quite clear information, there is information that Czechoslovak government, or at least some parts of the Czechoslovak representatives knew that the Czech soldiers or Czech legions were selling the arms to Korean independence movement.
That's right. As the ambassador just mentioned, the Czechoslovak Legion sold weapons to the Korean independence forces at the time. This raises several questions. How did the Czechoslovak Legion and the Korean independence forces first come into contact? And what kinds of weapons and how many did the Legion actually sell to them? To find answers to these questions, we met with an expert.
네, 저는 이름은 박환이고요. 역사학자입니다. 그리고 수원대학교 사학과에서 한 38년 정도 공직하고 최근에 퇴직을 했습니다. 주된 전공이 이제 만주와 러시아 지역의 그 항일 독립운동에 대한 연구를 하고 있고요.
Professor Park Hwan has also conducted extensive studies on the weapons used by the Korean independence forces and where they came from. His 2020 book, The Independence Army and Their Weapons, takes a detailed look at this very topic.
1919년 3.1운동 이후에 우리 만주 지역과 러시아 지역에 있는 독립군들은 일본 제국주의와는 이렇게 평화적인 어떤 그 만세운동이라든가 평화적인 방법으로는 더 이상 일본과 타협할 수 없다라는 그러한 어떤 생각을 갖게 됐고요. 그러면서 이제 1920년부터 보다 적극적인 어떤 무장투쟁을 전개해야 되겠다라고 생각했습니다.
In 1910, the Korean Empire was forcibly annexed by Japan. Countless people devoted themselves to the cause of Korea's independence, each contributing in different ways and from different fronts. One of those efforts was the armed independence movement. In 1919, the deep yearning for independence ignited the March 1st independence movement. It spread nationwide and lasted for several months. But the Japanese authorities brutally suppressed it with force. However, the March 1st movement became a turning point. It led to the establishment of the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai and marked the beginning of large-scale activities by Korean independence forces in Manchuria, the Russian Far East, and beyond. By the 1920s, armed resistance against Japanese rule was in full swing.
그래서 이제 무장투쟁과 관련해서 이제 한국에서 3대 유명한 그러한 전투가 바로 봉오동 전투, 청산리 전투, 그다음에 대전자령 전투를 이렇게 꼽습니다. 봉오동 전투는 1920년 6월 7일 날 발발을 합니다. 그래서 한 3일 동안 봉오동 골짜기에서 일본 제국주의와 전투를 벌였고 그 전투에서 이제 크게 승리를 했는데 다음으로는 이제 청산리 전투를 들 수 있는데 청산리 전투는 역시 3.1운동 후에 인 1920년 10월부터 한 6일간 청산리 계곡뿐만 아니라 여러 지역에서 이제 김대진 장군과 더불어서 나중에는 이제 홍범도 부대가 합세를 해서 일본군을 한 1000여 명 이상 살상한 그러한 전투로서 우리 한국 독립운동사, 특히 무장투쟁사에 있어서 대표적인 어떤 전투라고 이렇게 말씀을 드릴 수가 있습니다.
Among the most notable battles in Korea's independence history, the battles of Bongodong and Cheongsanri were major victories for the Korean Independence Army. And the weapons they used in those battles came from none other than the Czechoslovak Legion. Records of the Korean Independence Army's receipt of weapons from the Czechoslovak Legion can also be found in General Lee Bum-seok's memoir Udungbul, translated as Guiding Light in English. General Lee Bum-seok was a key commander in the Independence Army and later the first Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea. He played a crucial role as the commander of the 2nd Battalion during the Battle of Cheongsanri. The weapons supplied by the Czechoslovak Legion became one of the key factors behind the Korean Independence Forces' victories in battle.
현대전에서 중요한 부분은 바로 무기라고 생각합니다. 그때 체코군으로부터 이제 저희가 구입했던 그 무기가 바로 이제 그 청산리 봉오동 청산리 전투에 있어서 결정적인 어떤 역할을 했다라는 것이 우리 학계의 이제 일반적인 평가가 되겠습니다.
But this brings us to another question. How did the Korean Independence Army and the Czechoslovak Legion first come to know each other? Our team found a clue to this question in the 2020 book, Story of Czech-Korean Friendship by former Czech ambassador to South Korea, Olsha.
Czechoslovakia was gaining its independence, which was really accepted by the powers in the late 1918. And there was an important personality, future to be Czechoslovak President Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, who had a very close friend, Charles Crane. He was an American close friend of Woodrow Wilson, and he met with Yoon Hyung in November 1918 in Shanghai. We don't know what happened. We only know that they met. We know that Yoon Hyung was lobbying for the Korean independence. And now it's a hypothesis, of course. Maybe Charles Crane said to Yoon Hyung, talk to Radola Gaida. He is an important fighter. He is next door. And maybe that's the reason why Yoon Hyung was traveling only 2 months later in January 1919 to meet Gaida in Vladivostok.
While there are no surviving records of the exact conversation between Yoon Hyung and Charles Crane in Shanghai, it is thought that Crane may have encouraged Yaw to get in touch with the Czechoslovak Legion. That is because just a few weeks after meeting Charles Crane, Yoon Hyung traveled to Vladivostok, where the Czechoslovak Legion was stationed at the time, to meet its leaders. And there, Yaw met General Radola Gaida, the commanding officer of the Czechoslovak Legion. In January 1920, 독립신문, or the Independence newspaper, the official publication of the Korean Provisional Government, featured an interview with General Gaida. Through this article, we can see that General Gaida held deep interest and empathy for Korea's independence struggle.
What happened after that meeting? There was a coincidence. First of all, Radola Gaida had a feeling of togetherness with the aim of Yoon Hyung for the Korean independence. As I said, Czechoslovakia was fighting for that independence from Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it recently won the independence. That means it was logical that there was a kind of a bond between the two gentlemen. And there was a second reason. The legionnaires were supposed to return back, and it was a strong 50,000-60,000 people, but they couldn't take their arms back to Czechoslovakia.
First, it was obvious that the Legion would not be able to take all the ammunition with them during the evacuation home, because the ships were overcrowded and there was simply no space and no possibility to take all this with them. The legions were also very, I would say, influenced by the atmosphere of independence of Czechoslovakia, and they definitely had some feeling of like brotherhood with Koreans, that they also are fighting for their independence.
The weapons that the Korean independence forces received from the Czechoslovak Legion were diverse in type and considerable in number.
우리 독립군들이 이제 체코군으로부터 구입한 무기는 여러 종류가 있습니다. 일반 권총 같은 경우는 마우저 권총이 있었고요. 또 뭐 브라우닝 권총이라든가 여러 권총들이 있습니다. 특별히는 저희가 이제 그 체코군으로부터 구입한 것은 일반 독립군이 사용하는 소총입니다. 그래서 모신나강 소총이라고 해서 유효 사거리가 한 450m 정도 되는 거로 됐고요. 그 당시 일본군이 사용했던 그러한 그 38식 소총이라든가 이런 것보다도 유효 사거리가 100m 정도 긴 것으로 이렇게 되어 있습니다. 그리고 그 당시 이제 기관총으로는 이제 막신 기관총이 있고요. 막신 기관총은 분당 한 500에서 600발 정도 나가는 그러한 막강한 그 화력을 갖고 있고, 그 당시에 또 수류탄 같은 경우도 영국제하고 프랑스제를 이제 구입한 것으로 이렇게 되어 있습니다.
In terms of weapons, the weapons were provided first by the Allies because the legions were originally formed already under Russian provisory government of Kerensky. So by Russian government, French, British, later also American. So they had this, but finally also when they conquered the cities along the Trans-Siberian Magistral, they of course took the weapons from the storages which were in those cities.
Transporting the weapons supplied by the Czechoslovak Legion was not an easy task as well. And these were the routes used to transport the weapons.
무기 상자를 운반한다는 것 그 자체가 굉장히 험난한 일이었고, 그래서 보통은 무기 운반대로 구성해서 가는 인원이 보통 한 200~300명 정도가 농민들이 가고, 그 농민들을 또 보호하고 관리하기 위해서 또 무장 그 독립군 부대원들이 또 함께 가는 그러한 그 구성 형태를 띠고 있습니다. 그리고 일본군에 발각될까봐 숨어 있었다든가 그리고 중간에 특히 이제 이동할 때 시간이 한 달, 2달 걸리기 때문에 숙박 문제라든가 먹거리 문제, 이런 문제가 굉장히 그 고통스러운 그러한 한 단면이었고요. 그런 부분들 가운데서 해결할 수 있는 방법 가운데 숲속의 움막이라든가 뭐 등등 뭐 이런 쪽에서 우리 또 동포들의 또 적극적인 또 지원이 있어서 무기 구입에 있어서 또 운반에 있어서 많은 도움을 받았다라고 이렇게 기록되고 있습니다.
While uncovering the hidden stories between the Korean Independence Army and the Czechoslovak Legion, our team discovered a remarkable historical figure by the name of Lee Woo-seok. Lee Woo-seok, a member of the Korean Independence Army who fought in the Battle of Cheongsanri, personally took part in transporting the weapons purchased from the Czechoslovak Legion. In his memoirs, he vividly described the entire process. And it was Professor Park Hwan's father, the late historian Professor Park Young-seok, who interviewed Lee Woo-seok and then wrote the memoir based on that interview.
저희 선친께서 1980년대에 청산리 전투에 직접 참전했던 한 그분 조남이 이제 이우석이라는 분이신데, 그분은 이제 인터뷰를 쭉 하셨습니다. 그래서 그 인터뷰를 이제 그 책으로 만드셨는데, 한 병사로서 이제 청산리 전투에 참여하고 또 이제 그 이분이 직접 청산리 전투 참전하기 이전에 블라디보스톡에 가서 북로군 정사 한 대원으로서 블라디보스톡에서 이제 그 무기를 체코군으로부터 구입하고 또 그 무기의 운반대로서 이분이 활동을 하셨어요. 그래서 이제 그 무기를 이제 그 청산리 전투를 수행했던 북로군 정서까지 이제 옮기는 과정을 아버님 인터뷰 기록에 상세하게 나오고 그것을 이제 아버님께서 책자로 만들었고요.
Based on his memoirs, a film titled The Green Pine Tree was later produced. Through this movie, we can get a glimpse into 이우석's life.
이우석이에요. 처음엔 서로 군정서에 갔었죠. 신흥 무관학교에 다니고 싶었는데 어째 일이 잘 안 되네요. 전 홍범도 장군님을 제일로 존경하고 있어요.
In this film, we are also able to see a scene where the Czechoslovak Legion sold weapons to the Korean Independence Army.
여러분에게 가장 중요한 무기를 위해서 블라디보스톡으로 떠나는 무기 운반대의 경호를 책임지게 되어 있다.
여자는 무기 운반대에 지원하면 아이 돼요.
아군 형제 체코슬로바키아 군대의 무기를 소개해드리겠소.
조갑종 장사 나오시오.
The weapons the Korean independence forces purchased from the Czechoslovak Legion continued to have a lasting impact, not only throughout the 1920s, but well beyond.
I had a very interesting coincidental meetings on the occasion of the 19th anniversary of Cheongsanri battle. I was in the National War Memorial in Seoul, and I was approached by a very old, tall gentleman who introduced himself as being an associate of King Gu, whose name was Yun Kyung-bin. He was in his 90s, and he said, "I know about your arms. I was using these arms still in the 1940s when we were fighting." And that was incredible. The arms given in 1918, 1919 were really used and had an influence until 1945.
Long before Korea and Czechia established diplomatic ties, more than 100 years ago, a special hidden story unfolded between the two nations. As we share this story today, what meaning can we find in revisiting the long-standing ties that connect our two countries?
It is great, how our relations look like today, but I would say as well that we can't forget, what was happening in a previous times. The relations has been there for 150 years. We started with the knowing each other with the small interests and small news. But today, the world is totally different, and I think, it's just a proof. The communication which is today available, it makes people understanding each other much more than in previous times. So I hope that our collaboration and cooperation will go even further, and we will be stronger together.
The ties and efforts of the past are not merely pages of history. They still resonate deeply with us today. When we remember and understand our shared past, the friendship between our two nations deepens and new pathways of possibility open before us.